Hello, everyone. It's Glenn Rawson. It's Sunday night, September 8th, and I'm coming to you from London. I'm actually staying in the Radisson Blu Heathrow and here near the airport, and we're almost done. We're coming home tomorrow. We leave here tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, and I'll be back home in the States by 10:45 tomorrow night, Monday night. It's been a great trip. I've spent about a month over here in England with two wonderful Fun for Less groups, and we have had a marvelous time. Some of you have seen some of the lives I've put on Facebook. They've been such a wonderful group, and I have loved them dearly. It's always hard to say goodbye. But yeah, tomorrow we're on our way back. I am, however, coming back here I think it's next August with Fun for Less, to do, I think, back-to-back tours of the British Isles again. And I hope that if you're interested in coming back over here, you'll consider coming with me next August. It's a marvelous tour, especially if you have Latter-day Saint pioneer heritage that comes out of the British Isles. So anyway, just a thought for you. I have 5 stories tonight instead of 6 because one of them's extra long. 2 of the stories I'm going to share with you tonight are about events here in the British Isles, stories that I normally will share with my group. So I'm going to share those tonight, and we'll see how it goes. As always, my dear friends, I ask for your faith and prayers. I couldn't do this without your help. First story. This takes place in York. Margaret Clitherow was born Margaret Middleton in 1556 in York, England. At one point, her father was the respected sheriff of York in 1564. Margaret was well known for having a cheerful and generous nature. Now, in 1558, England became a Protestant nation overnight when Queen Elizabeth, a Protestant, decreed that everyone in her kingdom would be a Protestant, not a Catholic. Well, in those years after she came of age, Margaret married John Clitherow. John Clitherow was a butcher, and of course, they lived in the Shambles, which is a significant place there in York. It still exists. And because of his position, John Clitherow was also a chamberlain of the city. And together, the two of them had 3 children. Now, when Margaret married John, she was described as a beautiful young woman with a mass of light brown hair and clear skin, with a cheerful nature and an irrepressible sense of humor. And then she did the unthinkable. In a nation full of Protestants, in 1574, Margaret converted to Catholicism. That was illegal. Her husband, however, was an Anglican, and he remained a member of that church. And even though he didn't join her church, he still supported her. Margaret was fined regularly for not attending church services. Can you imagine? Her husband dutifully paid the fines and life went on. And at least 3 times, Margaret was sent to prison. Why? For not going to church. In fact, her 3rd child, William, was born when she was in prison. Now, that was illegal enough, not going to church, but worse still was celebrating the Mass, and the worst of all was harboring or supporting the Catholic priests. That was a capital offense. But Margaret chose to give the priests not only support, but sanctuary, and she secretly helped them celebrate the Mass. The place where she stashed the priests was a little hidey hole in her house there in the Shambles. Well, in 1586, I don't know why or how, authorities searched her house, and a small boy happened to glance over at the hidey hole, and the authorities discovered the priests in her house that she was hiding. Well, she was arrested, and she was brought before the city authorities, where she was offered the opportunity to plead. She chose not to plead. That would prevent a trial. If she pled one way or the other, or she pled innocent, there would be a trial. Her children would be forced to testify, and her servants, and probably subjected to torture. So Margaret chose not to plead. That automatically made her guilty. And they condemned her. Even though Margaret was pregnant with her fourth child, she was condemned to die. She was taken out to the Ouse River Bridge there in York. There's a marker there now. She was stripped of all of her clothes and laid down on the bridge with a sharp rock sticking up into her back. Then, because the authorities had not the stomach to do it, they hired 4 desperate beggars. They took the front door off of Margaret's house and put it on top of her. Then they piled rocks on it. It was called pressing. By the time they reached 800 pounds of rock on the door, the rock beneath her back was driven into her spine and killed her. It took 15 minutes. After she was dead, they left her body there on display for 6 hours. Then the city authorities took her body and disposed of it in a garbage dump. Later on, a group of Catholics found her body, dug it up, retrieved it, and interestingly enough, it had not corrupted. After they embalmed her, they buried her again in a place of honor, which they kept secret, so secret that the location of Margaret Clitherow is now lost to the world. Before they buried her, they detached one hand, which is now a most precious relic in the treasures of the Bar Convent in York. Margaret Clitherow died a martyr for her religion. The effect that had on her family? Margaret's daughter followed in her footsteps. They forced her to go to the Protestant church. She ran away and eventually made her way to France, where she joined a convent and became a nun in honor of her mother. Both of her sons, William and Henry, stayed strong in their Catholic faith, and both became priests. In 1929, Margaret Clitherow was beatified by Pope Pius XI and canonized as a saint October 25th, 1970, by Pope Paul VI. And today, she's classed among the 40 martyrs of England and Wales. Now, why do I tell you that story? This dear woman was so young. And what was her crime that took her life? Exercising a freedom of conscience. As you travel across the British Empire, everywhere you go, there are plaques and statues and commemorations of religious martyrs. Protestants killed by Catholics, Catholics killed by Protestants, or religious people killed by the crown. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. The cruelty that was put upon one another because they didn't agree on religious principles. I'm not a Catholic. Their theology is not the same as mine. But I respect and honor Margaret Clitherow for standing firm in her principles and exercising freedom of conscience, not to be dictated to by the English crown. I say to you, as an American, if you do not think our First Amendment rights of freedom of religion and freedom of conscience are inspired of God, then you do not know your history or your heritage. They are a gift. A man forced to believe cannot have faith in what that religion teaches him. Second story. There's a story behind why I'm telling you this story, and it's rather long, so here we go. In 1871, the White Star Line, cruise line, was established by Thomas Ismay in Liverpool, England. Now, in those years, there were two great lines, the White Star Line and their ships, the Cunard Line and their ships. And right now, the Cunard Line in 1871 had the upper hand. Their ships were big and they were fast, and the White Star Line could not beat their speed. So the White Star Line decided that they would do something even bigger. They would make bigger ships, fancier, more luxurious, especially for wealthy passengers. They also made staterooms that were in the third class, even nicer than what Cunard offered. Well, in September of 1906, the Cunard Line launched the Mauretania, the largest ship ever built. Bruce Ismay, the director of White Star at that time, decided he would outdo Cunard on every front. He would build 3 new ships, each one bigger than the Mauretania. He would fight the competition. And those 3 ships would be called Olympic-class ships. The first was going to be called the Olympic, the second, the Titanic, and the third would be the Gigantic. Well, this combined the resources of the American financier J.P. Morgan and the engineering firm of Bruce Ismay. The Olympic, the keel was laid in 1908. Then, on March 31st, 1909, at one of the biggest shipyards in the world, Harland and Wolff in Belfast, the keel of the Titanic was laid and construction began. It took 15,000 men to build Olympic and Titanic. The Titanic took 3 million hot rivets. It's only if you come to the Titanic Museum and see the process of those rivets to appreciate what that involves. By May 31st, 1911, the Titanic was built, at least roughed in. It was ready to be launched into the sea. It took 62 seconds to slide her down the waves, 772 feet. And to assist in that process, 26 tons of grease, soap, and tallow. It was claimed at that time that the moving of the Titanic was the moving of the largest man-made object ever made. And the largest gantry crane in the world was used to build and launch her. Well, when she hit the water, she was just a shell. But by March 31st, 1912, the Titanic was complete. Boilers, engines, and staterooms and funnels and everything else, the Titanic was done. When she was completed, she was 882 feet long, 92 feet wide in the beam, and 175 feet tall as an 11-story building. The rudder, that massive rudder, weighed 101 tons. Each of the anchors weighed 15.5 tons, and there were 3 of them. There were 2 wing props and a center prop. The wing props were 23.5 feet across, and each one weighed 38 tons on the wing props and 22 tons on the center prop. And it had the largest steam whistle ever made to that point. Now, as she hit the water, Thomas Andrews, the engineer, and Harland and Wolff claimed that ship was unsinkable. Note it, unsinkable. Why? Because of a new engineering design. They built 16 bulkheads, watertight bulkhead doors running down the length of the ship from bow to stern. The idea was that if anything ever penetrated the hull, they would seal off just that compartment and the ship would not lose buoyancy. They couldn't sink it. Well, the ship would be powered by two of the largest steam engines ever built to that date. They would have a combined output of 46,000 horsepower. Unimaginable. The Titanic had 29 boilers, 159 furnaces, and employed 289 firemen, stokers, to shovel coal and keep that steam up. And the Titanic was fast. She could travel at 23 knots, or 26 miles per hour, and carry up to 3,547 passengers and crew. When the Titanic was fully loaded, it rated at 74,000 tons, and the ship cost $7.5 million to build. Was it the HMS Titanic or the RMS Titanic? It was the RMS, which meant Royal Mail Ship. The Titanic left with 7 million pieces of mail bound for the United States. 3,364 bags of mail. And the captain, it was his last voyage. He had been with the White Star Line for 30 years. He was popular, highly respected, great skill. He was 62 years old, and Titanic, its maiden voyage, would be his last voyage. He was retiring. The Titanic's crew was 73 officers who would be responsible for running the ship, 200 engineering crew members, 300 stewards and stewardesses, and 35 cooks. On April 10th, 1912, the Titanic left Southampton, England. Interestingly enough, it is said that just before the Titanic left, the ship's mascot, a cat, I think her name was Jenny, carried her kittens back to the shore. One of the crew, seeing that, got off and refused to sail with her. But as the Titanic slipped out of her berth at Southampton, the wash created caused another ship to break its mooring lines and drift in front of the Titanic. There was almost a collision before the Titanic ever left port. In addition, there was also a fire that started down in one of the coal bunkers, but they managed to wash it down and got it under control. So April 10th, the Titanic sets out of Southampton. It made the 4-hour journey across the English Channel to the French port of Cherbourg, where 300 more people got on. After leaving Cherbourg, the Titanic traveled overnight to Queenstown, Ireland, where more people got on, and finally, at 1:40 p.m. the next day, the ship left Cork for New York across the North Atlantic. The Titanic steamed across the North Atlantic at a top speed of 23 knots. Now, it is said, some people argue, but it is said that the director of the White Star Line, Bruce Ismay, was on board the Titanic's maiden voyage and wanted to reach New York a day earlier than scheduled to get good publicity, set a record. And it is said that he urged Captain Smith not to slow down. The Titanic was scheduled to put into New York Harbor at Pier 60 on April 17th, 1912. Well, As the Titanic left port, and if you've ever been on a cruise ship, like I've been on many, there was no lifeboat drill. Why? Because captain and company considered it unnecessary. The Titanic was unsinkable. The 16 compartments. This ship can't go down. Not only that, there was only lifeboats sufficient. According to maritime law, the Titanic had all she was supposed to have. There were only lifeboats sufficient for 1,100 people. But there were almost 2,500 to 3,000 on board. The ship's unsinkable. Sunday, April 14th, 1912. The ship was sailing into ice. 9 warnings were sent to the Titanic about ice, but still, the captain pushed on full steam ahead. The ship by now was traveling at 22.5 knots and gaining speed every day. In fact, Ismay had already wired ahead that the Titanic would arrive on Tuesday, not Wednesday. Warnings indicated the ice was directly in the path of the liner. Now let me tell you about that year and that ice. Icebergs, as you know, 90% of their mass is below the level of the water, below the waterline. Some of those bergs that calve off the glaciers of Greenland can be as large as 150 miles in length and 70 miles wide. Most of them aren't that. We're not talking about little bergs. Those are called growlers. We're talking about mountains of ice, huge mountains of ice. And that year there had been unseasonably strong winds and powerful currents that had driven these bergs further south than they should have been. Those bergs should not have been there, but they were there. And as it were, the Titanic, the iceberg that she hit, was already 3 years old and probably only had days, if not weeks, left to live. It shouldn't have been there, but it was. The night of April 14th was bitterly cold. There was a moonless sky and a calm, dark sea. The water temperature, it is estimated, stood at 28 degrees. At 9:20 that night, Captain Smith went to bed, leaving First Officer William Murdoch in charge of the bridge. At 9:40 p.m., a message was received that there were icebergs dead ahead. That message never reached the bridge. At 10:55 p.m., the ship closest to the Titanic, the Californian, sent one last message that said, quote, "We are stopped and surrounded by ice. Shut up, I'm busy." The Titanic's radio operator radioed back. The Californian's radio operator shut off his radio and went to bed. The Californian was only 20 miles away. Why was the radio operator busy? Because there was new Marconi telegraph technology on board, open to the passengers, and they were sending messages all over the place and occupying the time of the telegraph operator. And he was so overwhelmed, he did not receive the messages. At 11:40 p.m., Frederick Fleet went up into the crow's nest where they spotted the bergs. He went up without binoculars. He should have had binoculars, but all he had was the naked eye. Why did he not have binoculars? Because there was a compartment that contained the binoculars. It was locked. And at the last moment before the Titanic left port, the officer in charge of that had been assigned to another ship, and reports are he had taken the keys with him. The locker for the binoculars was locked. Frederick Fleet had only the naked eye. As he crawled up into the crow's nest and looked out, he saw up ahead a berg drawing closer. It was huge, towering 100 feet higher than the Titanic's upper decks. Fleet sounded the alarm to the bridge, but the ship could not stop in time. 74,000 tons at 26 miles per hour has been estimated 38 feet per second. The Titanic couldn't stop. It tried to veer, but the ship struck the iceberg a glancing blow, hitting the iceberg down the starboard side and tore open the hull for 300 feet, only 10 feet above the keel. In other words, way down before the waterline, a giant gash, 300 feet long, the length of the ship. One crew member recorded that he looked out the porthole and he saw the berg right there and knew what had happened. Captain Smith felt the impact, rushed out of his cabin to find out what had happened, and then immediately Andrews, the engineer, and Captain Smith went below deck to see what damage had been done. Within 10 minutes after the collision, 5 of the ship's forward compartments were flooded and more were filling. And Andrews and Smith estimated that the ship had only 90 minutes to live. It's her maiden voyage. Most of the passengers felt the impact, dismissed it as nothing. A ship this size can't possibly sink. But within 10 minutes of impact, there was 8 feet of water in the lowest holds. Immediately, the alarm was sounded, and by 12:05, 25 minutes later, Captain Edward John Smith ordered everyone to the lifeboats. But they didn't know what they were doing. Suffice it to say, the lifeboats were lowered to the water, not full. They should have kept the lifeboats high, filled them with people, lowered them to water, and sent them away. But some of the lifeboats were launched with very few people in them. Had they filled the lifeboats properly and had everyone go to a muster station, then they could have saved 1,178 people instead of just 706. The last 2 lifeboats sailed away from the Titanic as it went down, and there were hardly anybody in them. There were all kinds of heroes that came out of that. But that's another story for another time. Distress calls were immediately sent out by the Titanic. Flares were launched. And as the distress call went out, at first it was a CQD, come quick danger. And then they adopted the new signal, SOS. The calls went out. The Olympic was 500 miles away. The Carpathia was 58 miles away. And as the signal went out, the Carpathia immediately turned around Captain Rawson and at flank speed set out for the Titanic. The Olympic was too far away, and the Californian never heard the signal. In fact, on board the Californian. With the radio off, the captain was standing on the deck. And just before they had seen the rockets go off and the flares, failed to realize what it meant. And as they watched the Titanic go down in the distance, they thought she was simply sailing over the horizon. They did not recognize the problem and did not come. And by the time they did, it was too late. At 2:05 a.m., the last of the Titanic's lifeboats was launched into the sea, leaving more than 1,500 people stranded on the Titanic. People tried jumping into the sea and swimming for safety, but the water was so cold they would only survive at most for around 15 minutes. The record at the time said that women and children were taken into the lifeboats. Men were turned away. Benjamin Guggenheim, the businessman, saw the last lifeboat leave and knew that he was not going to be rescued. He returned to his stateroom, dressed in an evening suit, and went back up on deck. And just before the ship was lost, he was heard to say, "We're dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." Some of the heroes were the men, the crews running the boilers, who kept the boilers stoked to generate power for the ship, knowing all the while that they had no chance of being rescued if they stayed. There are records in those last moments of men who held back, not getting into the lifeboats, who put women and children forward when they knew they would surely die. The Titanic, why did she go down? Because each of those 16 watertight doors, it was designed that if a few of those were penetrated, they would seal them off and the ship would maintain buoyancy. But they did not anticipate a 300-foot gash down the starboard side below the waterline. And it weighted the front of the ship. It filled up the first compartment, the second, the third. And the flaw in the design was that the water flowed over the top of the bulkheads, filled it up, ship sank, flowed over to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. The Titanic pitched forward onto her bow until finally, the bow, by 2:10 a.m., the bow was 30 feet underwater, and the ship was standing almost vertical with the rudder and props in the air. And at that point, the ship snapped in half. At 2:18 a.m., the ship had gone down far enough that the water hit the boilers and they exploded. And at 2:20 a.m., the mighty ship, the RMS Titanic, slipped beneath the waves. Second Officer Lighthauler was pulled down by the suction of the sinking ship, pinned against a vent. And then suddenly, as the ship went under, a great blast of air came up through that vent and blasted him free, shot him upward, and he managed to clamber aboard an overturned lifeboat, and he survived. It is said that the band continued to play right up until the last moment. Some say that the last tune they played was "Nearer, My God, to Thee." And into 28-degree water, 1,500 passengers were plunged. The great mystery of the Titanic that no one is really able to describe, and I quote, "The most heartrending part of the whole tragedy was the failure, right after the Titanic sunk, of those boats which were only partially loaded to pick up poor souls in the water. There they were, only 400 or 500 yards away, listening to the cries and screams, and still they did not come back. If they had turned back, several hundred more would have been saved. No one can explain it." End of quote. John Thayer. Colonel Archibald Gracie. "There arose to the sky the most horrible sounds ever heard by mortal man, except those of us who survived this terrible tragedy. The agonizing cries of death from over 1,000 throats, the wails and groans of the suffering, the shrieks of the terror-stricken, and the awful gasping for breath of those in the last throes of drowning. None of us will ever forget to our dying day. But as time went on, growing weaker and weaker until they died out entirely." End of quote. There were heroes, there were heroines, great stories. The Carpathia received the signal of the Titanic at 12:25 a.m. She's 58 miles away. She turned and came at flank speed, arriving on site at 4 a.m. and began picking up survivors. Only 12 were picked out of the water alive. The rest were gathered up out of the lifeboats. It took 4 hours to gather up all the survivors, and as dawn rose over the troubled sea, everyone was shocked when they realized they were completely surrounded by icebergs. The Carpathia left station at 8:50 a.m., bound for New York, with 712 Titanic survivors aboard. There would be no more. Word reached New York at 6:16 p.m., April 15th, 1912, that the Titanic had sunk. The world was in shock, and the press conflicted the reports. The Carpathia arrived in New York City Thursday, April 18th, 1912. 30,000 people lined the docks, waiting for word. How many exactly died on the Titanic has never been determined, because it was never known for certain how many were on in the first place. Approximately 1,500 to 1,600 people, with 712 survivors. Immediately after the wreck, ships went out and searched for bodies. Over the course of the next 6 weeks, 328 bodies were found. 119 were buried at sea, and the remainder were buried at Halifax, Nova Scotia, Fairview Cemetery. The Titanic brought about significant changes. Radio operators manned the radios around the clock. There was an international ice patrol formed to continually spot for icebergs in the shipping lanes. Maximum lifeboats for every passenger on board, muster stations and lifeboat drills on every voyage, and I've been on many of them myself. Many changes came about. When the Titanic went down, she's sitting in 12,500 feet of water. The two halves of the ship broke apart, and they're roughly 1,970 feet apart. It took the Titanic 15 minutes to sink, and they were traveling so fast that when the bow of the Titanic hit the ocean floor, it buried the bow 59 feet into the ocean silt. Every year on April 15th, the International Ice Patrol puts flowers on the ocean where the Titanic went down. The flowers are a tribute to the people who died that night. Every year I bring my friends here and we go to the Titanic Museum in Belfast. I've been to where she's built. I've been to where she was launched. I've been to where she stopped in Queenstown. And I've been to where the last were buried in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Why do I tell you this story? Because whether it's the cedars of Lebanon, or the oaks of Bashan, or the mighty RMS Titanic, all pride will be brought down before the Almighty. If ever we think we are unsinkable, invincible, unstoppable, every knee shall bow, every tongue confess that Jesus is the Christ. Those poor souls who died on the Titanic, it was not their fault. But because of the hubris of men, so many died. I hope and I pray you and I will learn from the Titanic that pride run amok will always sink men to hell. Let's take a break. How are you? Are you well? I hope and pray that you are. Well, I'll be home about a week, and then I'll be going back out on the Pioneer Trail. I was told this morning that we've got just a few seats left between the September 30th Martin's Cove Tour and the October 24th 3-day Martin's Cove Tour. If you'd like to come on one of those for just 3 days, there are seats available. Go to glenrossenstories.com. And I'm also told that the Year 5 volume is almost here. The VIPs will get it for free. Everyone else, it's available if you want it to give as a gift. Okay. Next story. This has nothing to do with England, but it's been on my mind lately. A few years ago, I went to the Tulip Festival in Amsterdam. Now, I love flowers, whether they're wild or whether they're domestic. I used to take my children on hikes in the mountains, going up the steep hillsides, carrying my books with plants, and we would sit and study wildflowers on the mountainsides in the spring and the summer of the year, identifying them. It brought us many fond memories, identifying these plants. Well, these days, my children are all grown and gone. I very seldom get to see them. And my time to go wandering through the mountains is not much anymore. And besides, nowadays, I have an app on my phone that everywhere I go in the world, I point it at the flowers and it tells me automatically what they are and how healthy they are and what the genus and species and how edible they are. It's marvelous. Well, nonetheless, I love flowers. And a couple of years ago, we were in the Netherlands touring the world-famous tulip gardens. I remember walking through Keukenhof Gardens and marveling at acre after acre of flowers, millions of them in a single garden, all over the country, and spectacular beyond description. These were tulips, real tulips. They were so big compared to ours back home. And the gardens were so orderly, so precise, so beautiful. If you ever get a chance to go on that tour, you really should. If you think you've seen flowers, oh baby, wait till you get to the Netherlands. Well, after that trip was over, I was sitting in church back home. I don't remember why, but I was just berating myself for being so weak and susceptible to sin and temptation. Oh, wretched man that I am. That mentality. Why can't I be better? Why can't I do better? Why am I always messing up? And suddenly, right there in sacrament meeting, I was given an understanding. In my mind, I saw those vast and gorgeous tulip beds so filled with flowers that there was not an inch of room for a weed of any kind to take hold. And suddenly, I understood the great tulip truth. Each tulip in every bed was planted one at a time by the design of the gardener's hand. One tulip had very little power over the whole ground, but when the whole bed was filled with those individual tulips, so carefully planted, there was no room left for weeds. So it is with our souls. Every act of real and constant prayer, daily scripture study, acts of service, and constant worship plants a tulip in the soil of our soul and fills the bed. And when by design we fill our souls with these constant acts of worship and devotion, there is little room left for the destructive weeds of sin and temptation. The Great Tulip Truth. Next story. Brigham Young paid a hefty price to become a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It took 2 years plus for him to become converted, but once he was, Brigham was determined and committed to the Lord and to the prophet Joseph. In fact, Brigham loved Joseph Smith and stood in his defense. He would later say, this is Brigham's words, "When I saw a man stand in the path before the prophet to dictate him, I felt like hurling him out of the way and branding him a fool." End of quote. On one occasion, by Brigham's own account, he did exactly that. One night, a man was yelling through the streets of Kirtland, railing on the prophet Joseph Smith, calling him a false prophet, and Brigham said, and I quote, "I put my pants and shoes on. I took my cowhide and went out, and laying hold on him, jerked him round and assured him that if he did not stop his noise and let the people enjoy their sleep without interruption, I would cowhide him on the spot. For we have the Lord's prophet right here, and we did not want the devil's prophet yelling round the streets." The nuisance, Brigham said, the nuisance was forthwith abated. End of quote. Doesn't stop there. After the dedication of the Kirtland House of the Lord and that great Pentecostal season of miracles, dissension rose up the following summer, and some people began to apostatize. Some of those became very vocal and organized in their opposition to the prophet Joseph. At one point, the apostates called a meeting on the 3rd floor offices of the Kirtland Temple to decide just exactly how they would depose Joseph as prophet and appoint David Whitmer as president of the church. Well, to their unfortunate luck, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and Uncle John Smith also attended that meeting. And after they had listened for some time to the machinations of the apostates, Brigham came to his feet and, quote, in a plain, forcible manner, told them that Joseph was a prophet and I knew it, and that they might rail and slander as much as they pleased. They could not destroy the appointment of a prophet of God. They could only destroy their own authority, cut the thread that bound them to the prophet and to God, and sink themselves to hell. End of quote. Brigham's opposition angered them, And as historian Ron Esplin said it, quote, among them, the old pugilist Jacob Bump, physically restrained from attacking Brigham, Bump twisted and shouted, "How can I keep my hands off that man?" No less angered, Brigham Young retorted that Bump could lay them on if it gave him any relief. The meeting broke up with the dissenters unable to unite in opposition. End quote. Now, setting aside the humor of that experience, I have thought many times over the years of what Brigham Young said. Was Brigham naive, blind, foolish? No. He knew perfectly well that Joseph was a man and as subject to weakness and sin as anyone else, yet Brigham also comprehended what too many do not. He knew his place. He later said, quote, I admitted in my feelings and knew all the time that Joseph was a human being and subject to error. Still, it was none of my business to look after his faults. You hear that? My dear friends, there is a fine thread of faith that binds us to God and to his prophet. No matter which thread we choose to cut, no matter which one we choose to cut, we cut both. No matter which thread we strengthen, the bond to the prophet or the bond to God, we will strengthen both. No man or woman, then or now, can come between God and his prophets. And you may set that in stone. Last story. I don't know why, but this one's necessary. I speak today to those whose lives are out of control or are broken seemingly beyond repair. If you are or have been or will yet be depressed and understand despair, there's a reason for hope and a way for your agency to be reclaimed and restored. In other words, if you're lost, I know a way to be found. During the Savior's Galilean ministry, he crossed over the Lake of Chinnereth, or the Sea of Galilee, to an area that's called Gadara. According to the record, as soon as he set foot on land, a man, if you want to call him such, saw him from a distance and came running towards him, yelling. The man wore no clothes and lived among the dead in the tombs, where he was heard night and day, crying like a wounded animal, cutting himself with stones. He was a creature of absolute torment, a wild man, so exceedingly fierce that no man could pass that way. And the people of the region were terrified of him. Numerous attempts had been made to bind him, to tame this crazy man, but all had failed. The man had superhuman strength. Chains had been plucked asunder by him and fetters broken in pieces. He was more a mindless monster than a man, lost and forsaken by helpless humanity. We do not know what brought him to that wretched condition, but we do know that he suffered a fate worse than death. His body was his prison, cohabited by a legion of devils. He had little, if any, control over it. His mind was surcharged with misery and constant torment. Agency was all but suspended for him. His life was out of control, and his very existence was an agony. death would have been preferable. Jesus came and cast the evil spirits out of the man. We're all familiar with the story of the devils entering into the swine, and the swine running off the cliffs into the sea and drowning. The townspeople came out to investigate the excited claims of those who had tended the pigs. It has always intrigued me that it was not the sight of 2,000 dead pigs floating lifeless in the Sea of Galilee that troubled them, but rather, quote, when they came to Jesus and saw him that was possessed with the devil sitting and clothed and in his right mind, they were afraid. End of quote. Can you see that? So radical and complete had been the change in the man that he frightened them. He was so lost that they had given up on him. There was no hope. And here he was, redeemed. It would have taken a power that they did not comprehend to restore him. And now, having seen that power, they were afraid of it and wanted Jesus to leave. They cast Jesus out of their country. But the story doesn't end there. The healed man asked Jesus as he departed if he could come with him. But the Lord responded by saying, return to thine own house and show how great things God hath done unto thee. End of quote. And the man did depart and went throughout the Decapolis, publishing how great things Jesus had done for him. And all that heard the man did marvel. That reclaimed man became a powerful missionary in the Gentile region of the 10 cities called the Decapolis. For all that he was lost and forsaken, the Lord reclaimed him, restored him, and empowered him. I consider this to be one of Christ's greatest mortal miracles. The Savior was not just healing an illness or an infirmity. He was not restoring life to a dead body, as awesome as all of that is. He was redeeming a man, body, mind, and soul. When our bad choices have limited our choices, cost us our agency, and bound us to irrevocable consequences, when we have through foolishness thrown our lives away and now are controlled by others, it is the Savior who knows the way and is the way to restore our agency, give us back our freedom, give us back our lost lives. There is power in him to change you. President Boyd K. Packer once said, Christ is the creator, the healer. What he made, he can fix. It's true. God be thanked for the gift of his Son, Jesus Christ, who, because he loves us perfectly, can heal us completely, change us totally, and make us whole when no one else can. Considering the incomprehensible cost of the crucifixion and atonement, he is not going to turn his back on us now. Therefore, come unto Christ, all ye that labor and are heavy laden. My friends, good night and God bless.